Franklin, alles goed? Top. All right, this is it. This is it. Thank you all for being here. It's very nice to see some new faces. I'll briefly introduce myself. My name is Kees, spelled K-E-E-S. You can pronounce it as C-A-S-E, the English word case, worst case, flight case, etc. You know the jokes. I work for 4Digits. We've had the pleasure of hosting this conference sprint for the past 3 days. And we're very happy that everyone has turned out here in such numbers and with so much enthusiasm. So I'd like to give a big round of applause for everyone who was participating, really. I would also like to thank our sponsors, because some other companies have provided financial support, which enabled us to pay people to clean the toilets. So thank you, Python United. Now, if I get this correctly, I have to use my notes here. I have to get the names correct, because otherwise people will ask their money back. I would like to thank Fabriek for sponsoring the drinks. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And where's Danielle? He's downstairs. I want to thank Divio for sponsoring the snacks. I hope you all enjoyed. All right. A short announcement. I'm looking outside. I was going to invite you to go outside, but not right now. We're going to have a couple of talks. 2 of them. First, a couple of longer talks, about 20 minutes-ish. And then a couple of lightning talks, which typically take about 3 to 5 minutes. After that, there'll be a break. And if the weather is not like this, I would like to ask you to go outside and we can have a group photograph just to show your grandchildren what you have been up to. Obviously, we will not do it if this is the weather, so I'll get back to you on that. But be prepared. Before the break, we just put on your coat, go outside if it's good. And to each his own, I think. Yeah. Okay, that's it for the business announcement. I would like to give my first speaker the floor, Tom Dyson.
Before I start, I want to make a special thank you. So, Case rightly thanked all the sponsors, but in particular, I think we should be. I'm going to particularly thank Case for his attention to my drawing. 4Digits have hosted this event now. This is the 3rd time. I think it's like the premier Wagtail event. There are many other Wagtail spaces now that have started up around the world, but they're all modeled on this one. It's an amazing thing. They manage the whole thing themselves. So I'm a bit close to myself.
Maybe you could use this one, because this one seems to...
Yeah, am I on? Yeah. They manage the whole thing themselves, and we don't really give them any input, and it's fantastically organized, and they're extremely generous hosts. So I think it's a really big thing that 4Digits are doing for the Wagtail community, and I would like us all to thank them for that. All right, so I'm gonna break this down to 3 parts, I think. What's going well, the bits that aren't going so well, and where we might be going next. So the good bits. First off, you're probably aware that Python is winning. So we all picked this language a while ago. I mean, for us, it was like 12 years ago, I think. And I feel like we got lucky, because this is a graph from a year ago, quite a famous graph that was on Stack Overflow. But I think the numbers have looked even better since then. And Python is now the fastest growing programming language. A lot of that is not so much to do with web development, actually. I mean, there was another interesting I think it was the PyCharms review showing that actually a lot of people are using Python now because of data science and machine learning. But I think the real reason for the growth is that it's becoming the primary language that people are learning in universities. So that's like, that's nothing to do with Wagtail, but it's a fortunate coincidence. And at the same time, Wagtail is doing well. So we don't really like to talk about competition too much, but we have been tracking. There's another Django CMS that we've been tracking a little bit, and in terms of GitHub stars, we are now, if you use GitHub stars as a metric, Wagtail is the most popular Python content management system. And so we're the most popular content management system on the fastest growing language, and that feels like that's a good place to be. We also, in the last year, there's some really big name users, and I know that this is helpful when you're pitching Wagtail to clients. It's very reassuring for people to know that there are these organizations out there, and some of these I think I might have talked about before, but they're really consolidated in the last year. So the NHS, the National Health Service, I think still the world's 5th largest employer, and they're using Wagtail, and it's not just on a small site. This is the main site, nhs.uk, probably one of the highest profile public sector sites in the UK. They've got a big team of people, editorial team, developers working on Wagtail the whole time. Google, so there was someone from Google at the last Wagtail Space talking about their decisions. They're using Wagtail now on a few of their blogs. The new one this year is on the cloud blog, and that's a big step for Google because it's the first time they've ever had a content management system on google.com domain, which has to go through all the security levels, and as I understand it, like security people basically make the decisions at Google. So that's a really big deal. And then similarly, NASA. We had NASA on our list a while ago. There was a kind of small site that they were running, but now it's the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. So that's like the kind of home of NASA. And I was lucky enough to go there last year to help them get set up on Wagtail. And it's a very high profile. It's a cool site, and it's another big name that we can use. It's a little bit of like I think there's a TV on or something. There's some signal coming out of the TV at the moment. Maybe if I just turn the volume down, that will help. Oh, is it? No, I think that's better now. I was at DjangoCon US in San Diego, and someone came up to me and said, "Thank you for Wagtail," and I accept the thanks, even though I'm not really responsible for it. But anyway, this was someone from Apple who has been working on this big internal intranet, and it's all powered by Wagtail, and that was an amazing thing to hear that. And then Mozilla, who are much less secretive, so all of their stuff is open source. They're increasingly running their sites on Wagtail, so quite a few of the big sites like foundation.mozilla, and they're really pushing in quite a few areas. So I'm going to come back to them a bit later. Also in the last year, we've delivered some big features. We've done really well, I think, in keeping up to date with latest versions of Python and Django. Quite unusual, I think, and it means that it's really helped our users take advantage of all the new features and improvements that are coming in the underlying platforms. Draftail, thank you to Thibaut for his work on this. This is the amazing new rich text editor that's in Wagtail, built on React. Really, I mean, as well as making a better experience for Wagtail editors, it's quite a kind of sort of fundamentally interesting project in its own right. And Thibaut's going to talk a bit more about the continued improvements of this, but it's a big step change for Wagtail. And then other things like faceted search in the admins works better. There's been a good push on accessibility. That came from a US event, and it's carried on over the last couple of events. So you might have noticed in 2.3 or 2.4 the darker green, which at first it might feel a little bit jarring when you're used to the kind of freshness, but I think it's a definite improvement, and I'm really happy that we're making steps in this area. And then the new starter page, which everyone really likes. There have been lots of great events, so as well as the original Wagtail Space, we've had events with the NHS at our offices in the UK. There was a fantastic event in Philadelphia hosted by Wharton, one in Minsk in Belarus. And then also we're finding that a lot of the other conferences so the Django conferences and the Pi conferences, people are setting up their own kind of informal Wagtail events and sprints within those events. The team has grown, so the core team, there's now I think 16 or 17 people. So after the last Wagtail Space here, we invited Kuhn and Cody and Lisa. We've also got Naomi from the States, and also, along with LB and Johnny, who are currently in Australia. They've really improved our front-end skills on the core team, so that's been really great. And most recently, Andy Babick, who's just recently joined Torchbox, he's the author of Wagtail Model Admin, which has become a kind of fundamental part of Wagtail, and now that he's at Torchbox, he's able to spend more time on that. So the core team's growing, and I'm really happy about that. Community support has gone well. So I feel like this is something that's really improved in the last year, and I often see kind of comments and praise for the friendly, welcoming community, particularly around on Slack and on Stack Overflow, and I really feel like there's been changes in that. And I think a lot of that, I mean, Matt has taken a lot of the burden on that, and most of you who have used Slack and Stack Overflow will have seen his name, and you know, I think that's a really important part of Wagtail's success. But what's great is that it's no longer just Matt, and there are a few of you in this room who have made a big difference to that. And as well as community support, also there's been some fantastic contributions. So two-factor authentication, this was something actually that Michael and maybe some of the others of the team at Lab Digital worked on last Wagtail Space, and I know it's very popular. We've used it on some of our production projects. Wagtail Whoosh is one you might not have heard about. Whoosh is it's kind of like SQLite for search, so flat file-based search. Much simpler to install for Elasticsearch if you don't have a huge amount of content. Wagtail Review. So I demoed something last year as an idea. So those of you that were here might remember that this is an idea that people could do reviews on shared front-end versions of the content. So like kind of equivalent to commenting on a bit of content in Google Docs rather than I guess the traditional workflow, and the NHS were really interested in that idea, and they've sponsored the development of that, and now that's a third-party plugin that's being used more and more widely. And a really interesting contribution is this CMS. Is anyone aware of this? Code Red. So I was a little bit sort of nervous when I first saw this because it's basically a CMS that's built on Wagtail, and it takes quite a different philosophical approach to Wagtail. So, with Wagtail, we've always been very clear that our markup has been completely unopinionated, and that we clear separation of content and presentation. And Code Red is more like helps you build the kind of sites you might build on using WordPress, but in Wagtail. But actually, I think it's a really interesting way in because you can start with a Code Red site and you get all these templates and you can theme them using Bootstrap stuff. And then, if you want, you can kind of eject from Code Red and carry on using it in a classic Wagtail way. And they're also starting to share some of their contributions back into Wagtail. There's a nice cache plugin, for example. So I'd check that out. I mean, I think it's quite a good fit for a simple marketing site based on Wagtail. And then as well as code, there's some increasingly third-party content. So for a while, it felt like we were the only people at Torchbox who were kind of writing blogs on Wagtail, but there's a lot more now. And someone started a Wagtail CMS channel on Reddit. There's this guy, Michael Yin, who's written a book, an e-book, which is pretty good, and some blog posts. And more recently, this guy, Caleb, who's got this amazing video series. I don't know if any of you've seen this. Is it Learn with Wagtail? Learn Wagtail? I should have put the link up. But if you Google Caleb, or I'll share the link afterwards. But there are now like 30 really high-quality videos on doing a lot of interesting tasks in Wagtail. Okay, that's a good bit. So I probably should have done the what's not going so well first and end on a high. But it feels to me like sometimes the pace of development is a bit slower. So last time we were here, Bertrand announced his React Streamfield project, and that's a lot of work, and it's not in Wagtail yet, and it's very, very close, but it's been close for a while. And I think this is probably just the nature of growing software projects. So we have, if we'd done this like in the first month, it would have been really quick, but now we have to think about all the different use cases, the kind of plugins that people are already used to using in Wagtail, the backwards compatibility issues, the changes in user experience, which might be confusing to the tens or maybe hundreds of thousands of people using Wagtail. And it gets harder and harder. So that feels like a challenge, and we're nearly there with React Streamfield, and it's going to be a big improvement. But I guess that's an example of a way that that kind of the cores of projects can get harder to keep moving fast. And I think a part of that is about our front end tooling. And this is not my area of expertise, but as I understand, the tooling that for building the Wagtail admin UI is not, is not the most current tooling, and I think there are definitely some improvements that we could make that will make it easier for modern front-end developers to be contributing and making this stuff faster. But it's difficult, kind of unrewarding work doing this kind of refactoring. There'd be changes that users wouldn't see, that would require a lot of code. And I think that has led a bit to the fact that the UI hasn't changed much. And I think this is one of the reasons for Wagtail's success in the first few months, is that it looks good, and we'd spend a lot of attention on making a nice user experience. And that was, in comparison with a lot of other tools that are out there. And it has improved gradually. There have been accessibility improvements, Dreamfield has worked better and so on, but it's pretty incremental. And I think that's partly because of the front-end tooling, but it's something that we want to focus on. We want to kind of accelerate the improvement in the UI. The diversity of our community, both in the core team and widely, is still, most people are white men, and that's the same in this room. And this is certainly not unique to Wagtail, but it's still definitely the case, and that's definitely an area where we want to do better. And then money, people don't really like talking about money in open source projects because it's all kind of, full of the goodwill that comes out of events like this. But it's just, constantly surprising to me that you look at the big names that I mentioned at the start, and the thousands of massive organizations using Wagtail, using the code that you're contributing to, and you think that, it just doesn't feel right that it's still, there's like 2 or 3 people working on this thing full time, and it's not a big money maker. There have been some attempts to do crowdsourcing, so Thibaut got some support for the work he's been doing, Bertrand obviously for the React Streamfield. We get little pieces of sponsorship, but I mean, this feels like a kind of, again, this is not a problem that's unique to Wagtail. This is something that the whole open source industry faces, and Django is kind of, this same problem times 10. Django is used by half the billionaire unicorn startups, and still like 2 full-time people working on it. But this is something that I would like to kind of edge towards, getting some more sustainable income to do the kind of the less glamorous work, to do the front-end refactoring, to do the documentation, to do the kind of, a lot of the work that Matthew does at the moment are things that probably a lot of people don't notice, but that you would notice if he didn't do. And it would be great to get to find a way of making that more sustainable. Okay, so what's next? There are more events. So the ones that we know about so far are we're going to run another Wagtail Space in the US, probably in the summer, probably in the East Coast. There'll be one in the UK at one of the Torchbox offices, I think, probably later in the year. And Lisa and Cody are going to have said that they're going to be one in Cape Town. And I expect there'll be more as well, because in the past these have popped up. And I would like to say right now that you are all, well, I won't invite on behalf of Lisa and Cody, but at least for the others, you're all very welcome to come to these, and it would be great to see you in some of these other locations. Another direction for Wagtail is this headlessness. So I think this is, I'm sure we were talking about this a year ago, but the idea of headless CMS is growing in popularity. There are some really interesting products, like hosted products, that do just the headless part. As kind of React and Vue-based front ends become more popular, I think that Wagtail could play a really important role in this. Wagtail, as some of you may have experienced already, actually is a very capable headless CMS. So it's had the API for 3 years, and there's some big name users who are using it like that. But we haven't done a good job of making that clear, of marketing it. There's not much documentation. We haven't written blog posts about it, and I think I want to do a push in that area. And I think a goal for Wagtail could be, if you want an open source headless CMS, then pick Wagtail. So it's not not because it's Django or Python, because you're a Django developer, but because it's the best open source headless CMS. I think that would be a nice and achievable goal. One aspect of that could be GraphQL. So this is the kind of this next generation API, and Arthur's going to be telling us a bit later about how he's using GraphQL. As I said before, I want to have an increased UI focus. At Torchbox, we're going to be investing in this. In fact, in the next few weeks, Simon is going to be showing some of the work that's happened in the last 2 days, and that's going to be continuing over the next few weeks. So some of that is going to be just about kind of tightening things up, but also we're going to just have a more complete overview about how to improve the most common user journeys for editors. Last time, I think I talked a bit about customer experience. This is an area where we thought that there might be a lot of push, and I guess this is things like personalization and A/B testing, which again have been quite kind of hypey in CMS circles. I'm not so sure now that this is. I mean, this hasn't actually ended up being so much of the focus. I think it feels like customer experience is something that is often used at kind of for selling, but often not so much at the point of use. And also, there's some really good tools that can work around the edges. So things like Google Optimize and other tools, where it might be hard for us to keep up with that. So definitely, there's tools like Wagtail personalization, very impressive tools that you can use right now. But for me, at the moment, it doesn't feel like CX is like the clear direction for Wagtail over the next year. As I said before, I'm interested in getting a funding push. There are so Mozilla, I mentioned before, they have been generous in the past, not with Wagtail, but with other open source projects, particularly ones that they use. You might know that they sponsored bits of Django, and they've expressed some interest, so they feel like a good candidate. And but I'll be seeking other avenues for this just to try to ensure this kind of stability of doing the basic stuff well. And that's it. Thank you all very much. I'm looking forward to the rest of the talks.
Is it? Yeah, it is. Okay, so now we know everything about Django, about Wagtail and where it's at. Thanks, Tom. The next speaker is Lisa Adams from precult.org, and Cody. I have to say, if you step to the right of this line, you will be out of the picture for the recordings. The second, everybody's going to be improvising. The second talk would be Chris Adams. Yes, are you? Would you be ready to do your lightning talk? Yeah.
When we say lightning, how lightning is lightning?
3 to 5.
3 to 5
minutes.
Oh wow, okay, that's much faster. We were talking about 15 minutes before. Is this the same thing? Because I can probably barrel through this in 5 minutes.
Try it.
Yeah? Just try it. Okay, let's give this a go.
Chris's talk isn't meant to be a beginning talk, it's meant to be a stand-up talk.
Really? Okay. In that case,
Do we have more? A bit more time?
Yeah, sure.
Cool. Oh, thank God for that.
No, we just
because maybe the bats or dogs could hear me, but I think I'd have to speak so fast that my voice would be impossible to hear. Okay.
I'm going to give you this.
1 2 1 2. Can you folks hear me okay? All right, now let's see if this connects. Okay, that works. Cool. Okay, now let's if I can make this a little bit larger. Okay. All right. Yes. The image rotation. Oh God. Okay. In that case, I do have. This is something totally separate then. Okay. This is really really fast. Okay. So, who here uses Wagtail and they upload images, and they've had a conversation with the client. They're like, hey, can I like rotate the image, please? Yeah. And you're like, well, okay, you can download it, or you can go and like change something yourself, and like you can download Photoshop. It's quite cheap and easy to get. And they're like, what's Photoshop, right? And I've wanted to have this in the platform for a while, and like there was an issue from 2016 that I was tracking, and I started work on. And this is my first ever Wagtail Space. And finally, look what we've got now: rotate image. So if you hit this, it rotates. Yeah, right. And God, you lot are such an easy crowd. I'm loving this. Yeah. So it's under the hood. We're using like CSS transforms to do this. So there's about I think 40 lines of JavaScript that make this stuff move around, and there is a big chunk of work that you have to do under the hood. So so I've actually, in order to make this stuff possible, what we've actually done is we've made some changes to Wagtail, but then we also looked all the way down the dependency tree and made some changes to Willow so that you can actually make this work with PNGs and animated GIFs. It's GIFs, right? Not GIFs. It's GIFs. GIFs? GIFs. Yes. Let's not go there, right? And with Pillow, so that should work. Anything that Willow will work with, this will work with now. And that's largely it. And let's say that, well, you can basically, there's only one way to turn it around, because if you turn something all the way around, then, well, you figured like we don't need 2 buttons if 1 button will do. And you've still got the same kind of nice thing to kind of get your kind of focal point stuff. So we've got all that stuff there. And like, yeah, I'm not going to hit save because I just introduced a bug just before this. But yeah, with a bit of luck, this should be in the next version of Wagtail that you see. And then finally, we can rotate through increments of 90 degrees and dance. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Chris. That was indeed a lightning talk, and sorry for the confusion. Your real talk is going to be up later. So, Koen, I don't know how many talks you have, but right now you're going to talk about debug templates, and you have 5 minutes. So, let's see. That's small. The same. Maybe you can help me out. Yeah, but that's only for. I just want to have the display there. I think. Yes. Yes. That's better. Yes. Hello.
My name is Koen van de Kamp. I work here at 4Digits. My presentation started, so I will talk fast. Lucas, this is my lightning talk. So you're not involved. That's the next one. Basically, anyone who programs Wagtail templates bumps into this once in a while. You have this template, and then you have like this, I don't know, a field from the current context, and you don't know what it actually is. It gives an error or something. So I wrote this little template tag, and I do this all the time. It's called PDB, Paulus de Boskabouter for Dutch. For all other people in the world, it's the Python debugger, and it actually just receives a value and returns it, and here's a stack trace. So if I have this page, I pipe that value to the debugger, and then when I load a page like this one, it keeps on spinning because I just entered the debugger here, and I can see what val is, and I can do all kinds of interesting stuff with it, like inspect it, and maybe just I'm lazy and I have one hand, so I use tab and I just can see what this does, and it does that. So this is an awesome fast way to get into your context through the template and inspect your values. That was my talk. Thank you.
Next up is Chris Adams. Simon. You're the one. Enhance. Duco, are you ready for after this? Cool. Yeah, sure. I just heard that the next guy is also ready, so. Yeah? How do you mean? No.
Is it?
No, we're all dizzy.
Oh, okay. Let's pray.
That's the USB-C, I think.
Oh.
You might want to work this one. You did change the settings already, right? Or open the settings menu?
Every now and then it does work. Do something?
No. It should recognize you right away.
I see LG artworks. Users output.
Cool.
Amazing. One sec.
Just.
Okay, we'll just have to live with the resolution. Yes.
This is all I get from my Linux machine, so I have to live with this. My mini talk will be about Wagtail Headless. Wagtail Headless. Currently, the headless implementation for Wagtail is in REST, but lacks a bit in explicitness. RESTful APIs should be, in the words of our good friend Fielding, should be explicit, should be providing the state of the application within the representation of the thing shown. The current route for the headless implementation is this. So it is very explicit. It says error 404, but it's not really what you would expect from a API route, would you? So you really have to know that you would have to go to pages to be able to see pages, or you have to know you would go to images to be able to see images. Okay, I have made a proposal for a slightly better, well, in my point of view, slightly better implementation of the Headless API, which conforms to the acronym of HATE OAS. Not all acronyms are actually good, which means hypertext as the state of application, hypertext as the engine of application state. Even the acronym is, well, even the phrase is bad. Which means that you want to show your end user what you actually can do, starting from the root of the API. So if I go to my API root, it actually says what you can do. So it says, okay, you can find pages, images, and you can make a tree of the whole website. So if I go to pages now, in this case, it basically gives you some documentation on pages. It gives you the list of pages. It gives you the paging links if you have paging. And it also tells here at the bottom that you can actually do filter on specific fields. You can actually do search on this API resource, and you can do ordering on the fields that are specified. If you go to one specific page, for instance, this one, it tells you what you can do. I'm now logged in as admin, so I can actually publish this page because it's not published. Hopefully this will work. Sometimes it does work. And given that it's published, I can now unpublish it. If I'm going to the same page as an anonymous user, I can actually not publish it. I don't have the same action because I'm not allowed to. And if it's not published at all, this is the same page, then I don't even see it. So this is hypertext as the engine of application state. What you can do is what you also see. If you don't see it, you can't do it. So you can also see in the head of this page, close to options, that I can't delete it being anonymous user. Sadly, this is not reflected in the HTTP headers, something I might have a look at. And in theory, I should be seeing that I can actually here delete this page, being root or being admin. My proposal is to make the API a bit more explicit than this. That's it.
Thanks, Nico. I have two options for the next talk. One is Thibaut, and the other is Chris. Which one of you would like to go first? So you would like to go first, I guess? No, we don't have it yet. We might shortly, but... Okay. Yeah, Thibaut will go first then.
This is like extreme presentation, isn't it? You've only got like exactly enough time on the laptop as you have to talk. So
Yeah.
okay, cool. Thank you very much. That's better. Okay. Let me just set a timer now. Okay, 2 secs. Okay, 15 minutes. Starting now. Okay, hello everyone. My name. Oh yes. Hello everyone. My name is Chris Adams. I'm going to talk a bit about building a planet-friendly web with Wagtail, because today is the climate strike day, and there are lots and lots of children who are basically striking from school all around the world because we as adults need to get our act together and do something about climate change. I'm going to talk a little bit about how this relates to, well, like tech and what we do, all right? Basically, what I'm going to do is share with you a kind of mental model for thinking about how we can actually reduce the emissions associated with our industry and what we do. Because right now, the emissions of like tech as an industry are about the same. Okay, they're larger than Canada. They're about 2% a few years ago. And the last report I read before was about 3.5%. That was a report that came out from a think tank in France. To give you some context, that's greater than aviation. That's greater than, say, shipping. So it's like, this is like a non-zero amount of emissions that essentially are on our shoulders to do something about. And the mental model I'm going to share with you is this idea: platform, packets, and process. And I'm going to show how that relates to you when you work as a Django developer. So as you can see, platform is basically the energy that comes from running servers and infrastructure that you control, all right? Packets is stuff when you send data to people if they need to access any of the services you have. And process, these are kind of like emissions built into the decisions you make as an organization about where you work, how you travel, how you actually position, where you site your office, how people can actually work remotely or not, all the stuff like that. And this is usually a longer talk, so I'm going to barrel through this fairly quickly, but there are also variations of this online, and there's a couple of YouTube talks which basically go into more detail than all of these. This is also a notebook, so if you're curious about any of the figures, you can run it yourself and execute it, and you'll see some like charts and things from it later on. So, platform. Energy from energy and therefore emissions from the stuff that you run yourself, all right? Now, there's two ways you can think about this. One of them is provisioning, like how you kind of match your usage, and basically we know what servers are, right? Like big fat servers like this. And when you think of servers, you think of maybe something like this, but they also come in like this kind of size, right? You can run Wagtail on either of these two things depending on how much traffic or what kind of usage you actually need, right? And I want you to hold that in your head, the idea of like provisioning up and down, matching like resources to usage. What I'm going to show you now is a graph of basically how people use the internet, all right? So you can see at like midnight, as we fall asleep, we tend to use the internet less, all right? And then to the point that when we're mostly asleep, none of us are using the internet. Then we wake up and we start using the internet some more as we kind of check your email, check on Slack. Then we are working through the day. Then we all go home and we watch Netflix. And then you see like a massive uptick in usage again. And then it starts. So we've got this kind of rhythm of how like people use the internet, right? And this is actually useful for thinking about provisioning, right? Because what we used to have, when we got like big servers like we had before where you provision just a whole server to yourself, you're kind of like paying for all of the capacity so that you can meet, like let's say you're running some kind of service that everyone's going to use. You need to make sure that you can always hit this stuff. And all this stuff here is essentially you burning energy without much real use, right? You're wasting it, right? And like this is how we've used to kind of work with infrastructure as a service when we buy things on a kind of monthly basis. Now, what a lot of us use now these days is something a bit more like, say, Kubernetes or platform as a service things like, say, Heroku or Cloud Foundry. And these offer some options of scaling things up and down. So rather than having one giant server, you've got a series of smaller VPSs. And you might kind of change how many you actually provision depending on how much use you have. So straight away, there's all this kind of usage we're not doing now, and then that results in like not actually not emitting CO2, but also saves us cash, which is good. You know, that kind of makes us look good. So this is infrastructure. This is like platform as a service, all right? Then we have kind of cool things like functions as a service, stuff like Zapper and Chalice. Has anyone used functions as a service here or played around with any of this stuff? Okay, there's 1 or 2 people around, and although there is lots of assumptions that are made into how you use these tools, you can run them with Django, and there are various talks around this, and I think we might even have a talk about that later on today. So basically, rather than scaling, you basically scale on a per request basis, which gives you a really, really nice fit, which means you're reducing much more the kind of waste that comes as a result of running infrastructure, right? And that's one thing I want to kind of like keep in your head, right? Because provisioning is one of the levers that we actually have that can actually save some money and also save some emissions, all right? I'm going to skip over some of this stuff here because it actually might provide some useful background. So a few years ago, you might have heard lots of stories about like Bitcoin eating up all the power usage in the world and things like that. Generally, we've kind of got better at like running servers because of the stuff I showed you before and being able to kind of like basically match usage to demand. I mean, provisioning to demand, that we've actually been able to do pretty well to like level off a lot of the expected energy usage gains. So we were looking like total carbon bastards up here, right? But thankfully, we've actually had some kind of decent impact here now, all right? And one of the reasons we've seen that is that because we've basically seen this shift where previously we'd have loads, so maybe a few years ago, we'd be running a lot of infrastructure ourselves. We're increasingly moving a lot of this stuff to cloud, which means that we end up making much better use of the compute that we do actually have, all right? These are all figures from the International Energy Agency, and there's loads and loads of numbers behind this if you're curious and want to nerd out over this kind of stuff. So that's one thing, provisioning. The other thing is your provider. So right now, okay, who knows if they're running infrastructure on, like, say, renewable power or coal or anyone? Okay, we don't know. It's really, really hard to find out. The default, if you don't know, is going to be coal. All right, so it's going to be running on fossil fuels. So the thing that like our kids are out kind of campaigning about, by default, we are using. That's like us driving around with lead in our cars without us being aware of it, right? And if you do know about it, then maybe we could do something to fix that. Thankfully, it's actually kind of getting a lot easier, right? I started working with this company called the Greenbend Foundation. We did a load of really, really nerdy stuff to basically take this alphabet soup of like offsets and renewable energy credits and all this stuff here into literally like a okay, no okay thing, right? This is actually a browser extension. You can have it. So as you zip around the web, you can see, is this site a happy kind of green site like this? Or is it not such a happy site like, say, Twitter right now, who run on mostly fossil fuels, all right? So the thing is, this is a relatively low-risk thing for you to change, right? All the big people, or all the big providers now use this kind of stuff. So if you're running with Amazon, let's say you're running on, say, one side of America, like US East, which is full of coal country, you're going to have like quite a lot of embodied emissions of what you do. If you run in, say, Oregon, which is on the other side, it's running on renewable power. Like switching regions just gets rid of huge amounts of emissions. And there's all these steps that you can take like that, all right? There's a whole list with the Greenbend Foundation, which is why I'm working with them. But yeah, this is getting so much simpler now, and you don't give away a kind of competitive advantage the way you used to before, all right? If you care about this, there are some tools you can use, all right? So if you're using, okay, show of hands, who's using like platforms, something like Heroku or something before? Okay, right? There are some really nice things. There's one thing called Lightswitch. There's another one inside Heroku themselves. There's another tool called Fire, which is basically costs $10 a month. And what it does, it will basically look at your usage, and depending on how quickly you're responding, it will provision things or not provision things for you. So if you're going to save more than $10 in like usage, then it's a no-brainer, right? I know that Cloud Foundry also has this. I don't know if Divio does do this, because when I looked at Divio, there is like a flat pricing scheme, but there are tools available to you. And if you want to play around with, say, this kind of cool functions as a service stuff, there are two tools you have. Chalice is the one which is kind of available from Amazon, which is their blessed tool. And Zapper is a kind of abstraction layer across a number of different providers. And from memory, what Zapper does is does something clever with Whiskey, so you can basically make stuff run without too many changes, whereas I haven't had too much luck making Chalice work with AWS, but I know there are other people in this room who've had more experience. And like, yeah, there are tools you can play around with. You'll save money and possibly the planet in the process, which is generally a good thing. So that's platform. Packets. This is the other thing that you actually might have where there's going to be an impact. It's hard to measure, right? And that's because the internet is actually distributed, right? It goes through all around, and like all these different things affect it. So different times of day will affect how the internet is powered, or how, say, power is running in a given country. So solar panels, not so good at night. But thankfully, wind is kind of useful, right? Different countries have different mixes, and different networks have different kind of energy intensities. So sending stuff over wireless is actually like 60 times more energy intensive than using, say, a wired connection. All right, and then I'll skip the last one because it's not so important here, right? Thing is, you can actually see some of this stuff. This is electricity map. This is an open source map powered by open data. It shows you the kind of carbon intensity per hour all around like the world, all right? So you can see, like, say, England is actually not bad, or Britain. Great Britain has got better over the last few years because they use loads of gas now. France, full of nukes, so like, you know, really, really low carbon. In Germany, we're the land of coal and solar, so we're kind of in the middle. Poland and Estonia, really not great because they're massively invested in coal. So basically, powering stuff through there or running stuff through there is going to have a different impact on basically the emissions associated with the infrastructure you run. I'm going to give you a worked example because it makes it a bit easier to understand like where you might actually focus some efforts here. Do you remember what this whole kind of GDPR thing last year, right? So GDPR landed in May, and this provides a really interesting case study of what happens if you were to kind of radically change how you design websites, mainly by switching off all the kind of creepy adware because GDPR suddenly made that illegal and you don't want to get sued, all right? So USA Today is a site which was about 5 megabytes in page load previously, right? And they basically had to switch off all the GDPR infringing adware, and they basically went down to a really fast loading 500 kilobyte site for people in Europe, which was great for in terms of user experience and provides an interesting case study for us, all right? So we can try and like work out some numbers here. So, okay, USA Today, 437th most popular website in the world. So what, 3.7 million page views a day, all right? We can actually kind of look at some numbers here. So, I don't know, 5 megabytes times 3.77, that's what, that's like 18.4, yeah, 18,500 gigabytes of data per day. So we can work out like what the emissions associated with just that much, and if we could actually kind of reduce that massively. This figure here is basically the emissions intensity I've seen from just shifting a gigabyte of data around, all right? And this is a number from, there's loads of really dry academic stuff, but this is the best number I could find so far. This actually, that was a figure from 2015. I'm going to keep the maths easy for us to just follow along. So basically, every 2 years, we get better at shifting data around. So it kind of like halves every 2 years. So let's say in 2017, because 0.03 is easier for us to calculate with, that's kind of like a figure for like shifting a gigabyte of data around, right? And then if we take that, we say, okay, well, how much, we know it's like what are these kilowatt hours? So how much CO2 is emitted from, say, a single kilowatt hour, right? Now, this is America, and because they use loads of coal, they have quite a lot of CO2 emitted per kilowatt hour. But we can like work out some numbers for this, all right? So let's see, energy per gigabyte, 0.3, bandwidth, times this, bit of a Python, okay, so that's about half a megawatt hour, all right? And then we say, well, how much CO2 is that? That's about, okay, so 240 kilos of CO2, so that's about maybe 4 of me, I suppose. 4 of me in CO2 per day is like is the carbon footprint of running one of the most popular websites in the world, all right? Now, okay, the numbers aren't quite right here, but is that a lot? Is that meaningful? Who knows, right? It might be useful to kind of compare it to this. So I tried to find some kind of meaningful comparison. That's like a flight from New York to JFK, or if we're Django developers, have I got one that shows you the other one? Okay, so that's like, that's slightly less than a flight from, say, Amsterdam Schiphol to Copenhagen for DjangoCon in a few weeks' time, all right? So like that's the kind of savings that you're actually introducing here. And this stuff kind of relates to what energy is actually on the grid, all right? So we've basically got this kind of interesting trend taking place that basically over the last, say, 10 years, renewables has got cheaper and more popular. And we're getting to the point that like fossil fuels have become really falling out of favor now. And I imagine there's okay, who here has a pension? Okay, if you are not asking already, the chances are that you're probably quite invested in fossil fuels right now. And there's a lot of your pension's value is actually priced into this stuff right now. So if you do have a chance to speak to your employer and say, hey, could we not be invested in fossil fuels? You'll thank me in future, all right? I'm going to skip over this stuff quickly because I don't think I've got enough time to talk about like decarbonizing of the grid, basically. But basically, there are places you can make an impact, and if you might want to think of it, and like, yes, there is like an environmental link between fast-loading cool web pages and the environment, but it's not really something that I'd really kind of try to focus all your time on for environmental reasons, because essentially we're kind of fighting against this crowd here. Like, to give you an idea, like the way that we use the internet in Europe is very, very different to how we're seeing it develop elsewhere around the world. So in India, right, you now have data plans. This is like 200 rupees, which is about €2 a month, right? For 1.5 gigabytes per day, right? So this is like a totally different way of using the web that we think of. And as a result, you see people basically using YouTube the way we might use Google, all right? And you see, oh Christ, I'm gonna have to go through this really quickly. I'm gonna zip over a load of this stuff here because the main thing I was gonna tell you is, if you care about this stuff, there are tools you have available to you. This book is the best book I found so far to talk about web performance with people, because it's basically someone saying, okay, this is how much money you could be making if your stuff loads quickly. This site here tells you all the ways that you can do it. There are tools you can use in Django as well, right? So basically, all the stuff to use for compression and caching, it basically works. So if you know how to use these tools and you already have these skills, then you can make a measurable increase, but it's not as good. It's not going to be such a change as just literally just running yourself on renewables here, all right? I don't really have so much time to talk about process, so I'm going to run through this. But basically, if you're a really, really, really good digital agency and you're really thinking about like this climate change thing, Whole Grain Digital is one example. They're a UK-based one. They generally did a load of kind of carbon footprinting of themselves, and they shared all the spreadsheets and stats for this stuff. And they worked out they got roughly like 0.7 tons per member of staff per year for this. All right. So when you see how like a flying to like Copenhagen now is just added 3/4 of that, then this is how like this is what I'm talking about. Like how in your process there are decisions you make which affect the impact of what you do and the projects you're working on. And generally, like even when you're being quite good about this, a huge chunk of what we do is based around kind of commuting and travel. So if there are ways that you can actually not need to travel quite so much, or if you're able to kind of work from home, you can actually make an environmental argument for this, as well as making it easier to actually rejoin the workforce, keep people who might want to have kids, all these things like this. There's lots of environmental reasons for doing stuff which are good for people anyway, and it's worth looking at. I think I'm going over time, so I'm going to pass on this stuff here, but okay, we're going to go over this stuff here. But basically the thing, if you do care about this stuff, there's one thing I would suggest that you do. Literally just look at how you're running your infrastructure. It's really, really easy to switch and use something renewable. And like, this is like running cars with lead in it right now. Like, all of us can make a decision here. And this is such a low-risk decision for us to make. I'd recommend you do that. I'm going to pass on the rest, but that's kind of it. If you do care about this, there's loads of funding available for kind of working on things like this. I am being paid full-time to work from now until September to basically build tooling to make it easy to work this kind of stuff out. In Germany, there's a fund called the Prototype Fund. They'll basically give you 50K to work on an open source thing to address some of these infrastructural issues, all right? So there's loads of stuff around as well for this. That's kind of it. Yeah, if you're interested, please get in touch with me. I'll be around. There's also a Slack group for people who actually do care about this stuff. And yeah, thank you very much for your time.
Next up is Thibaut with Draftail extensions.
My talk is very visual, so I'm really hoping that green guards are good with me today, and they aren't. Damn it. Yay! So I just want to make sure that you can see all of the things I'll be showing, because it's all basically demos of bits of UIs, so I want to make sure that it's visible from the back of the room. This should be fine. And the actual demos. Okay, it might be cropped slightly, but it should be fine as well. So hi everyone, thank you for coming. I'm Thibaut. I'm a web developer at Torchbox since 2 weeks ago. But before that, I was actually part of the Wagtail core team for about 2 years. And I worked on this new rich text editor that Wagtail has since a year ago called Draftail. So today I'm just going to be showing you some demos of things you can do with Draftail and things we are hoping to do with Draftail directly inside Wagtail. So improving upon the authoring experience within Wagtail directly with this rich text editor. And before I actually get to the demos, I want to give you a bit of context because again, I just started at Torchbox 2 years ago. I was actually, 2 weeks ago, sorry. I actually started this work on Draftail 3 years ago at this company called Springload in New Zealand. And the main reasons why we wanted to make this happen was that we were very frustrated with the existing editor of Wagtail back then. So you don't have to read all of this, by the way, this is just my notes. I'll just say them out loud, but better. So our main frustrations were just the editing UI being quite poor and unpredictable within the editor, and people not being able to rely on the fact that the manipulations they would do in the field, so for example, setting a heading level, setting a list item, not being able to rely on the fact that these would always give the same results, which is quite annoying when you want to type your content and can't rely on what will actually be output on the page. And quite common frustration as well was the fact that if you copied your content from Word and pasted it into the field, you'd have all of this garbage of styles from words that you don't really know what to do with if you're just an editor. So we decided to build this new editor to address those concerns and also to allow people to actually develop extensions to the editor much more easily if they want to make custom formatting for their end users, for their websites. So yeah, that was in 2016 at Springload, and we shipped Wagtail about a year ago before Draftail, sorry, about a year ago before Wagtail Space. And since then, I actually haven't been involved with Wagtail day to day in my job. So I've actually been supported by people through Patreon to make the stuff that I'm going to show you today. So just want to say thanks to those people who've been supporting me over the last year, because without them, I just wouldn't be there, basically. So last year I was here as well, and I actually wore the same shirt. Don't know what it says about me, but yeah, I thought I should mention that. And I was talking about Draftail as well, so yeah, kind of. I had the same water bottle and same computer, and yeah. And I was talking mostly about why we did it and how it worked behind the hood. And I was really, really also keen to talk about how it could improve the experience of users of the CMS. And I was saying during my talk, oh, I'm going to write this blog post about like UI and UX and how this makes it better. And this never happened. So today's talk is kind of this blog post, which is ways in which we can improve the experience of content authors within Wagtail with this new editor. And again, before I dive into the demos, I want to talk about why this matters, at least to me. So the basic premise for me is that what matters the most about our websites is the content that's on them. Because if you build a site that has a great design, great features, but the content is terrible, then the experience for the end users of your website will also be terrible. The whole point of having a CMS is that you can structure the content in a way that's useful for the people who actually depend on the content day to day. So for example, the NHS, it's quite important for them that their website is understandable for whoever needs to look up medicine or look up practitioners, doctors. Yeah. So to me, the basic premise is just that content goes first. And if you start thinking of it this way, then it means that the authoring UI within the CMS for content actually is pretty important. Because if people can't structure their content, if people can't input whatever they want to publish, then the site just suffers regardless of how good it is otherwise. And yeah, if the UI of the CMS is lacking, what ends up happening is that people will still write content, except they'll do it outside of the CMS, say in Word, or Dropbox paper, Google Docs, whatever, and then have to have this extra step of copying that content and entering it into the CMS, which I think is a valid use case, but can be quite painful because, of course, between what us as developers set up in the CMS and what Word has available is quite different features. So to me, it matters quite a lot to try and bring those people who are using Wagtail but authoring content outside of the CMS to bring those people in the CMS, and also supporting those copy-paste workflows. And finally, the last reason why I think this matters a lot is that other tools within the content authoring ecosystem are innovating a lot. So I assume you're all quite familiar with Word and Google Docs, but these days tools like Dropbox Paper, for example, are actually quite compelling alternatives to these ones. And the main reason why so many people find them compelling is that the authoring experience when you enter content into a document actually feels much nicer than those traditional word processors. And yeah, other examples of similar patterns are Slack as well, which has quite a lot changed how we communicate and how we enter our messages. And of course, kind of an obvious one as well is WordPress's new Gutenberg editor, which changes a lot as well how WordPress users enter their content. So yeah, that was a lot of context. Now for the fun part. A bit more context. So those demos, I'll be showing them to you outside of Wagtail, but they should still work the exact same way within Wagtail, except that my PR hasn't been merged yet or released, but as soon as my PR is merged and released, you'll be able to do the same things I'm showing you right now in the CMS. And the other thing about those demos is that they are really just proof of concepts that I built to try out those APIs and see whether it was possible to build those things. They aren't actually polished designs that we're going to release into Wagtail right away. So this is just basically ideas, things we could be doing. Then what we end up actually integrating into Wagtail, that's another story. So this is Draftail, a very simple version of it. One of the main features of Draftail is that it should be very easy to configure what's available. So this is the most simple demo that has nothing available really to it, just 2 block level things and 2 inline things. Now let's go to the future. And I'll start with one of my favorite examples because it's very simple and just a net win. And this is something I stole from WordPress. I'm very glad to say they do really good, nice things around editing. So you want to enter a link into your content, you get your URL, you copy it, select some text, paste it, and now you have it. You have the link on your content. And thank you. I totally stole this from someone else's code, but yeah. And like, this is super simple, but saves you quite a lot of time. You don't have to learn those keyboard shortcuts. You don't have to mess with the link picker within Wagtail, which can be quite slow to load. You can just take your link, you know where to put it, and you enter it, and that's it. And of course, within Wagtail, we also have to consider how this works for internal links to the site, so it will be more complicated. But from the end user's perspective, the experience is much more straightforward. And of course, if you just paste the URL directly inside the text, it just makes it a link as well, because why wouldn't you want that? So yeah, really simple, but I like to start with this one because it's just so easy to get and saves so much time. Another one, which I talked about last year as well, was how keen I was to see this editor being used outside of the traditional pattern of rich text, bold, italic, headers, and so on, because I think this editor, with all of the APIs it brings, can also be used even if you just want to type plain text. So this field right here is really straightforward. The only thing it does is to constrain the user input to 1 line. And no matter how much I press enter, it will never go to 2 lines, which actually can be quite useful if you want to do some rich text, but on a heading element, and you don't want to allow the user to enter more paragraphs or more list items or whatever. And yeah, one of the other reasons why I was very keen to do this back at Springload was that we were really wanting to give our content authors control over, for example, how their heading levels broke when the page got resized. And so here, for example, even though this is a single line, you can still enter line breaks within it, and it will still preserve it as a single line just with a line break. So this is kind of the nice type of like very refined interaction that you can build with this editor. And yeah, something that's much easier for each and every one of us to understand is Markdown shortcuts. So if you have experience with Markdown, you might not actually want to learn how to use a new editor. And here you can just type Markdown style prefixes for blocks, like list items as well. This is a very common pattern. And it just works, and you don't have to learn the shortcuts. You can just use what you know already. And if you don't know Markdown, well, you can just reach at the toolbar at the top and still use it. So I really find it quite cool. And again, this was already there a year ago, so nothing too new here. But I did a few more. So for example, now you can also do italic and bold. So again, like this is just markdown syntax, and then it makes it italic. And again, like just saves you so much time that you don't have to learn all those shortcuts and use them. And same for strike through, which might be less common for people to know the shortcut of, and code and so on. Yeah, horizontal rules as well, just like 3 hyphens and that's it. Yeah, so just like a big time saver. And a nice experience for end users who know Markdown already. Emojis. I love emojis. I don't know how you feel about emojis. I feel like our modern websites that are built with Wagtail don't have enough emojis. So I was really keen to find a way to make that happen. And this is really just an emoji picker, but yeah, this is just an example of the type of thing you can build with this. And this is actually a ready-made package, which is why it kind of looks out of place in this editor. So Draft.js, which is what Draftail uses, has this ecosystem of ready-made packages, and this is just one of them that now you can just reuse right away and have fun with. Action lists. So one more example of the type of thing you can build with this. So list item, and then kind of the same as GitHub's Markdown syntax, and this makes an action list that has checkboxes. And you might, it would be very fair for you not to have any use for this in your website, but this is the type of thing that, again, you can build with this if you want to. And none of this functionality I'm showing you here with action lists is reliant on the internals of Draftail. This is something you can do as a user of the editor, as a developer implementing the editor. You can implement this with its APIs. One more example, which comes from Slack. So in Slack, you can enter those commands that starts with / and whatever the command is. So I just made a couple, /HR, makes an HR, and /embed, and the URL of the embed. And you wait a bit. I didn't implement the loading state, but yeah. And it inserts an embed. Which again, like you don't want people to have to mess with the embed picker if they don't have to. If they can just know to type embed and paste their URL that they have already copied anyway, it's just so much faster for everyone. And one of the key points I want to get to with this is that when you think of embeds, it starts to overlap with stream field within Wagtail. And here this is creating an embed within rich text. But it would actually be nothing preventing it from inserting an embed in stream field and simply splitting the editor in two and inserting the embed in between where when you make that happen. So yeah, kind of on the same theme as blurring the lines with stream field. This editor doesn't have the traditional toolbars. It instead has inline toolbars that are common with Medium, for example, has these, and lots of other tools, of course. And also the sidebar here that has the block level things. So I'm sure you're familiar with these already, but just to show you that it's actually something you can build as well with the editor that Wagtail has at the moment. And what I really like about this as well that I should mention is that it makes the editor have much less of a presence on the page. Your content is much more visible if the UI doesn't take up the whole space. So for example, if I go back to the previous one, the toolbar is quite noticeable. If you have tens of those fields on the page, it ends up being very just distracting, this kind of contrast. Whereas here, until you actually start to interact with the content, the UI just isn't even there, which is quite interesting. Yeah, and that's really about it for my demos. So I'll give you some food for thought and give you some insight into what's next for those things. So again, those are just proof of concepts to demonstrate the APIs and I guess the value of those interactions. But then we will still have to polish some of these before we integrated them into Wagtail. And for things that we don't integrate into Wagtail, we also have to do documentation and tutorials for you all to be able to use those APIs with your own projects. And just want to mention quickly how you can help with this if you're interested in it. To me, what I would value the most is to actually hear from the people who use those UIs, so your content editors on your sites. If you can all, or you might have already done it, if you can do some user research with them and ask them what are their pain points, how they could make their editing UI better, and then pass on the feedback to us, the core team, this is super valuable. And yeah, just have them try out those features and see what they say and whether they actually want to use Markdown shortcuts or not at all. And for you developers, try to use the APIs as well and give us feedback on how you see them working for you. And potentially get involved with the future rich text task force. We've been talking in the core team on how to get more of the community, the developer community, involved with the development of Wagtail. So if you're interested, we could have a core team / rich text group that is focused on delivering those experiences within Wagtail. And that's it for me. Thank you. Does anyone have questions, by the way? Nope. Okay.
Very nice. That was the last speaker before the break. The weather looks kind of okay, I think, if you put on a jacket. So I'd like to ask you to come outside. Our photographer is ready, I think, for a group photo. So we'll do that first, and then we'll have a drink, and then in like half an hour we'll continue with the second session. Thanks.
Kind of okay, yeah.
Is it not kind of okay?